Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Bridge podcast, where medicine meets the arts. This podcast grows out of our 9-week narrative medicine course called The Bridge, which is where we explore narrative medicine, what it means to listen, read, and write more attentively. Last week, we looked at perspective and bias through Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, a text that reminds us that every story, even our own, is told through lenses that distort and reveal in equal measure. This week, we turn to temporality and the lived experience of pain, to the way that time bends and warps under the pressure of illness, healing, and transformation. Our close reading text for this week was Sarah Manguso's Oceans. It's a lyric meditation. I don't really even know what genre to call it. Maybe Daniel, you and I can talk about that later on. If it's a poem, is it a prose poem? Is it an essay? I think lyric meditation might be as close as I can get to an umbrella term for this. That moves from mountains to oceans, from order to surrender, from the slow tectonic time of the body to the swift, unpredictable time of illness. Manguso writes about cancer, about motherhood, and the impossibility of control, about what happens when the old forms, even the ones that once sustained us, no longer hold. Our guiding questions for this week are going to be, how does pain or fear of pain reshape our experience of time? What does it mean to live in what Manguso calls oceanic time, when order dissolves and the self must learn how to reform? And finally, what forms, literal or symbolic, do we create to hold that flux, to hold that ocean in? And today I'm going to be discussing all of that with the wonderful Daniel Valadez. He's a physical therapist who works with veterans in Arizona. Hi, Daniel. Hey. Daniel is so much more than a PT, though. He's also a father of two beautiful little girls and an ultra marathoner and a writer and a poet. He just wrote this gorgeous work called The Unbecoming that I am just loving reading. It's not available on the market yet, but when it is, I will put a link in the text below this video so that you guys can check it out and buy it if you like. And he's just generally a guy who keeps challenging himself and keeps trying to chase that meaning, figuring out the things that matter most to him in life and pursuing them. It's been a real joy to get to know Daniel. I've known you for how many years now? At least five.
4 or 5 years, I
Five.
believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've been doing, is this the third time you've taken this course?
This is the second time.
Second time you've taken this course. I keep adding one on. And we've been working together in one-on-one sessions for years and years too. So I count Daniel as one of my closest friends. I'm so happy to have him on this podcast. So I'd love to start by asking you, Daniel, what drew you back to the bridge for this round?
Right. I guess it's starting off with probably just you, right? It's just kind of putting that out there and just kind of the bridge and just the phenomenal experience that I had last time and kind of exploring pain and the space in between patient and provider and making some additional connections, right? And so Anna was also going to be right. She's also a part of it. So that was probably the final piece that really just kind of hooked me in to be like, all right, was just excited to see some of her writing and stuff as well.
Mhm.
That's always such a joy to read, and even just the interpretation that she has in her close reading as well. So that kind of brought that in there. And so just overall, right? How do we kind of get these connections with other people, and just kind of excited to read what other people share, and you feel perhaps the sometimes intimidation of what others write compared to what you write as well. But it's yeah, that was just I think that's what really kind of pulled me in. Mainly you, right? And she did as well. So
Great. Great. Yeah. I mean the people are what pull me back to it too. I always say that narrative medicine makes the study of narrative medicine, doing this practice makes me want to constantly ask everyone their opinions about everything because I realize how much people are holding out on us when they have to put their thoughts on paper. I'm like, whoa, there's so much going on behind your eyes. And I learned so much from everybody. I just realized everyone is so brilliant all the time. So yeah, I feel that too. And you're right, Anya has something special about that as well. So much fun to learn from each other. So in the past, you've said you're constantly rewriting who you are. That's a phrase I pulled from the self-introduction that you wrote. Um, how does that process of rewriting show up in your work with patients or in your own creative life? How do you constantly rewrite yourself?
I think when you work with people that have been living in pain for so long, who are no longer living life, um, that alone, working with them, can actually start to kind of bring you down almost to where they're sitting. And there's an aspect of where we need to share that common ground with them, but I don't need to stay there with them. And so it really is kind of just challenged me over the years about this concept of self-care and looking out for yourself. And so I'm teaching people how to get back to living life, experiencing life despite having pain. But am I myself doing that? And so I challenge myself and I look back at these things and I ask myself when I'm experiencing burnout, when that nervous system is legit just shot and got nothing, I'm like, am I living life right now? And
Mm,
typically that answer is no.
mm,
Right. And so I try to put something, sometimes it's not realistic to have at least one thing on the calendar, per month, but can I do something once every 2 to 3 months? Something to kind of be striving for, looking forward to. What am I, is there a challenge that I could be doing? How do I fulfill life? How am I experiencing all these things? And so we have these like almost gigantic kind of visions or ideas of what we could be doing to experience life. And yet at times it also challenges me of living the day to day.
mm,
How can I experience the most out of life day to day? And I think kind of having small children really ground me in that.
mm,
Also, my dog being one of my two dogs, right? She's 14. And so, right, we're talking about time. And so in a sense, time isn't with me. Right. So how do I experience what it is in these smaller moments as well as in these bigger moments? And so working with people in pain, they're not living those things. And so I get to see how I can experience life, even more transformationally in a part kind of thanks to them.
mm,
They're not living it, but I can still be almost in a sense doing my part for them. And
mm.
so, right. Yeah, it's like how do we do these things? And so that's the real challenge of I think kind of working with people in pain, and there's very little kind of quote unquote reward. We don't get a lot of wins out of it because it's slow, right? Retraining your nervous system around pain, like that takes time, that takes readiness, that takes, being humble and kind of letting go of the ego. And not everybody is ready to do it. And everybody's always looking for a quick fix. We're always looking for a hack, and social media doesn't help. The social media is wonderful, right? Here's my rant, right? Social media is wonderful in a lot of ways, but in a sense, it's a big distraction at times. It wastes our time. We're looking for quick dopamine hits. We're looking for that instantaneous fix of whatever that may be. So it's like somebody saying, do this one exercise or take this one supplement. And, I'm like, I'm right, turn that person off because that's not life. It's not about just the one thing. So, yeah, that's probably a very tangential
No, I
answer.
love it. I love it. Yeah. Anytime somebody throws the word fix out there, I automatically get suspicious. And you're right. When working with pain and with illness in general, things, it's slow progress. It takes time, it takes readiness, it takes humility, it takes a checking of that ego. And I love how you put yourself through those those same lessons that you put your patients through, that you yourself take that time to check in on your readiness, your humility, your ego. And it is how you live your life. I've seen this in practice for years. Yeah, beautifully said. Okay, actually, before we move, I was about to shift us right into oceans, but I want to pause here for a moment. Would you mind talking a little bit about the work that you do in the VA and the typical type of people that you see, what their typical issues are?
So, right, I'm also a veteran, and I think that's the connection that I've always wanted to come back to the VA to kind of give back. And so, the Phoenix region has been notorious for when like the scandal came out in 2013 around that time, and so the VA didn't have it wasn't always looked at as very positively as a result. And so, my time being Phoenix and up in Prescott right now, it's like, how do I always try to change a veteran's experience, just one person at a time? So that's really that one level of connectedness, me being a veteran, wanting to help kind of support veterans. And much like the world all over, I would say chronic low back pain, right? That's kind of something that I see all the time. And it's highly variable, right? So there's this population that I work with is predominantly a retired area. And so there's a lot of veterans that have been right sent to Vietnam. And so now not only looking for people that ended up, voluntarily serving, but people that were also drafted. They didn't have a choice.
Mm.
People that were exposed to Agent Orange and kind of all the toxic things that happen as a result of that may or may not be influencing, in a sense, their kind of condition. And then you start kind of coupling things with like surgeries, whether it's back, hip, shoulder, whatever. You got multiple surgeries. There's typically an aspect of trauma as well. And one thing that I've kind of began to kind of question a little bit. I've never, who has the time to to kind of study and research everything, but just that aspect of what draws veterans, right? What draws people to the military, and so what exposure to some kind of traumatic event did I have as a child that now I joined the military to perhaps look for that better way of life to escape where I was at. And now I experience another layer of trauma as a result. And are those things kind of then coupled? So, typically a lot of people have had some sort of trauma, right, when they've kind of come through my door. And so just trying to pull all of those things together. It's not typically just somebody who happens to walk on in and be like, yeah, I've had knee pain for 10 years. No, right. It's never that simple, because we're starting to look at what are the other, psychosocial factors that are going on, history of trauma. Divorce is also a really big thing, in the military as well. So my poor joke is that, having a divorce as a veteran is kind of part of the standard issue of being a veteran, right? And so you start coupling all these things, and it's like it all matters, right? All of these things matter, and they're adding up in their life in some way or form that perhaps now contributing to their state of pain. And so chronic low back pain, right? That's probably the most common thing a lot of people see, but in a sense, that's coupled with all other sorts of things as well.
Great, great. Thank you for bringing us here. This is really important stuff because, Daniel, you and I met through the pain science community. And this course was originally designed for people interested in pain science or who come from pain science, but we've broadened it now to include a wider group of folks interested in narrative medicine and the borderland between healthcare and the arts. So a lot of the folks listening to this or watching this might not have this background in pain science, and I think it's really important that we take a moment to discuss this. What I hear you talking about is really the biopsychosocial model of pain care, of healthcare in general. And the biopsychosocial model is something that is distinct from the biomedical model, which just looks at the issues in the tissues. It just looks at, what's going on in your scans, what's going on in your lab reports, what functional movement or visual assessment tests can I do to tell me what's going on in your body. And as I understand it, the biopsychosocial model is takes that into account, but it also looks at all of these other things that you're naming and how this larger context of a person's life contributes to their experience of pain. Whether that you used chronic low back pain as an example. Have they had surgeries? Have they had physical or emotional traumas? What's their marital status? What was the did they choose to be in a position where they could get hurt, or did they not choose to be in a position where they could get hurt? You mentioned people who'd been drafted into wartime scenarios. What exposure to trauma led them to military in the first place, and what traumas have they experienced while there? All of these very particular to veterans, and how that can compound the experience of pain from that biopsychosocial perspective. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's the perfect segue into a discussion of oceans, which this week we've been talking about temporality and how time can change based on an experience of pain. That comes right out of this idea of the biopsychosocial model of healthcare. You have, in order to understand how somebody is perceiving time, in an illness or pain experience, you have to look at the larger context of their lives, their histories, what they imagine their future to be. Um, and I think Sarah Manguso's text, Oceans, poses those questions in really interesting ways. Um, so first off, let's just talk about oceans. I know this is an unfair question. I'm going to put you on the spot. If you had to summarize this crazy long 11-page adventure of a text, um, what's going on just from a plot perspective? What's happening in simple terms? What's happening here?
I would say they're faced with their own mortality. And
Hmm.
in that moment, everything from the past is pulled forward as they're trying to simultaneously reel in their future.
Oh, that's a gorgeous encapsulation. Yes. So the speaker of this text, um, for shorthand, I'm going to call her her, because Manguso typically writes in an autobiographical mode. So I feel like that's fair, but I feel if anybody wants to challenge me on that, I welcome the challenge. I'm gonna call it a her for now. So the speaker here, she has a cancer diagnosis, potential cancer diagnosis. She's about to go into a surgery to remove some organs, four of them, in fact. And she's dealing with exactly what Daniel's describing. Sudden, challenge to her stability in life sends her reeling through not only, what's going to happen to me now, but through a whole barrage of memories from the past that really destabilize, decentralize herself. So she talks about these two different experiences of time. Um, and she uses these great metaphors of the mountains and the oceans. Can you describe the mountains? What metaphorical work are the mountains doing for Manguso's speaker, and what metaphorical work are the oceans doing? How do they function in the text?
For me, it was that interpretation of the mountain being very, I guess, deliberate and just kind of slow,
Yep.
forceful kind of movement. This is moving forward no matter what. Whereas that ocean, that does definitely represent a lot of chaos associated with it as well. Do you get stillness from the water? Are you expecting the tsunami? What's going on with the ebbs and flows of just all of those things, right? What potentially happens in terms of the earthquake somewhere else. So this disruption of a mountain, other side of the world is now just kind of rippling through the chaotic ocean. And what's the result of that? And so for me, right, just kind of really forceful, deliberate. Both of them are just very supernatural like forces that just cannot be denied. And so they're just kind of approaching them in different ways. And so she uses that ocean, I think, just to kind of weave in and out and kind of like this flowing and where is she at? And you can see things in her own writing as well,
Mm,
kind of where it's like, this is where she's at, and then kind of pops somewhere else, and then perhaps kind of brings you back. And so that's kind of how I interpreted some of her ocean and mountain.
great. Yeah. Yeah. Agree. Yeah. Mountains are deliberate, solid, slow, dependable, kind of like slow linear time just trucking along, and you actually described it as forward movement, which I hadn't realized until now. But yeah, mountains, she says, they waited for me to catch up. They're always somewhere like ahead in the distance that we're like slowly traveling toward, this maybe a goal. Maybe mountains have to do with that linear sense of having, stretching forward into the future, having a straight line toward a goal. And oceans are just like, I don't know. I mean, everything goes. There's this fluid motion, this creation and destruction. She says, um, uh, it sickens me to loll about in the wet, dimensionless chaos of the oceans. And yet she wants to learn how to write in a way that is oceanic. And you said you can see it in her own writing. Do you think she succeeds in writing in a way that is oceanic? Do you
Uh,
see? What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, if we start looking at the fact that it's what you said, 11 pages, so
Yeah.
it's vast, right? And there's so much, and it's not like it's just completely just word after word after word, and it's spaced out, right? And so there's like this intentionality, and so she's kind of taking us on a ride of this ocean herself. Like we're paying the ferryman and getting in the boat, and we're cruising along on her ocean, right?
Right. Right. And yet there's something counterintuitive about putting the ocean into writing because it's trying to assign a form to the formless. It's trying to contain a thing that is doesn't have a eludes constantly eludes the container. But that also is the joy of reading this for me, the way that meaning isn't accumulated throughout the text in a linear way. All of these different pieces you can tell just by how it's written, in these little chunks, fits and starts and spaces in between, single line ideas and then longer stories. And each of these things are kind of piecemeal, um, uh, put into the text in a kind of jigsaw type way. Things don't naturally follow. But at the end, you have this whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. It's creating a feeling that is somehow can't could not be have been described by a linear narrative, by a mountainous narrative. So yeah, she is doing something very interesting with this performance of the ocean through a counterintuitive method of trying to assign it a form. And I think she's doing something similar with this tattoo, Um, can you describe the tattoo for me, just for anybody who might not have read this yet? What is the tattoo? When does it exist?
So right, I guess that tattoo is coming heavy today, huh?
I'm so
So,
sorry. It's unfair question after unfair question. I should just name the podcast a series of unfair questions.
so I think that it's in place, right? If I'm recalling correctly, right, from a dream, and
Yeah,
it was this higher calling of what she needs to be able to do, but it becomes a part of who she is and her story because she's not able to do it right away,
yeah,
right? Perhaps kind of not even wondering if that's going to even she's going to survive the surgery, and has all these kind of questions, and doesn't want to risk for infection, and right, like all these medical
right.
questions that kind of come up. But that's where it's like already this vision of like who she's going to be, right? And the circles, perhaps, we could always have some debate around there, but almost an entrapment as well, kind of like this, constant reminder of that. Is it, you know, I don't know, is it kind of liberating in a sense to have this, or is it in a sense kind of being shackled to your own fate that I have this, kind of these, circles around my forearm, these I believe like bluish green circles that she had. And so kind of tying the ocean into her arm, weaving that in as well.
Right. Yeah. You talk about the lines as entrapment, and I want to read a passage that I think describes that. So our speaker is going in for this surgery to remove some critical organs related to her cancer, and she wants to get a tattoo of two blue lines running parallel around her arm and meeting back at the middle. And in a way, this she's imagining this as something that contains the ocean, the sky, and the sand. So there's a containment issue here, but there's something infinite in the circles. There's something it's contained and yet it's infinite. There's a both and happening here. Um, I want to read this passage though that you just reminded me of. She says, my life consists of keeping a trillion details in my head, and I get most of them right, but not every day. Enough of them. And then I have to deal with my fuck ups, with the child right there next to me, learning what happens when something gets in that's not deliberate. It's the trillion details that have gotten in the way of that non deliberate thing, I think. It's hard to demarcate an area in which the trillion aren't allowed. maybe this is another function of the tattoo that I haven't gotten yet. The tracing out of an area in which I'm unaccompanied by the trillion, which is so interesting as I'm looking at it. At first, when I first read it, before I read it aloud just then, I was thinking about the tattoo as a thing that's keeping out the non-deliberate things. Like you could think of cancer as a non-deliberate thing that is somehow let in. You could think of the fuck ups as the non-deliberate thing that's let in that she's trying to create a container for. But that's not actually what she's saying. I'm realizing as I read this aloud, she's saying it's the trillion details that have gotten in the way of that non-deliberate thing that she wants to keep out. It's the trillion details that she has to keep in her head all the time, all the stuff of life, so that she can't focus on the non-deliberate thing. Oh, now that's very interesting. What do you make of the non-deliberate thing here? I don't know what I think of it, so it's a stupid. What
That's
are you trying to do?
hearing the non-deliberate thing makes me think of right old Bob Ross, the painter, those happy little mishaps, those happy little mistakes, right? And so,
Right.
but that's life. That's nothing is completely planned out, and that kind of from the station I'm at in life right now of being a father with little ones, they are a bunch of non-deliberate actions, right? And it's like that is the experience of life. How do I keep all of this nonsense, right, away so I could just allow that experience to be, right?
Yeah.
How do I immerse myself? So I'm going to have this tattoo that represents that binding of like me being able to shield myself then from it so I can be experiencing more of non-deliberate actions.
Absolutely. You're reminding me of something another one of our friends posted on the boards, not even this week. I believe it was last week about the struggle to stay really present with kids. And it's a struggle I so get. I think probably every parent does at some point. It's like, how many times can you sing row, row, row your boat or watch the same episode of Miss Rachel? But these kids, I mean, they are this glory of non-deliberation that enter our to-do list worlds, and mess it up in this delightful way. Um, and yet the pull of the to-do list is so strong. And it's interesting here how she is trying to create a container for the non-deliberate. Um, Maybe interesting how the text is trying to create a container for the non-deliberate too. So interesting.
I just
So,
see
mhm,
perhaps pull it together, writing very oceanic,
mhm.
having those different kind of stanzas with different weight to them, different amount of lines, as if these are the waves that we're riding that are kind of non-deliberate as well, right? How do I just kind of surf all of this? Because it is, we're just surfing through life as well. And in a sense, do all those other things really matter right out in the water with me? Or does what really matters is the non-deliberate wave that's come up out of seemingly nowhere?
Mhm.
It is a challenge, right? I mean, children teach us so much, but we think we know everything. And that would be an action of like bringing it back to pain, would be this we don't play, right? As adults get older, we stop playing. We go to work, we do our to-do lists, right? We go maybe exercise, right? How often do we play? Do we set, right? To have no time thinking about temporality as we're having this discussion, there is no concept to time. My daughters are 2 and 4. They don't know what 5 minutes means. They don't know what 2 days means, right? So in a sense, they're able to exist and play, and yet we don't, and we wonder why we struggle, and at times they don't.
Oh, so interesting. Yeah, my almost 3-year-old, it's hilarious because anything that happened in the past happened yesterday for her. It's just yesterday. Like it could have happened 2 years ago. Somehow she'll remember it and she'll say it happened yesterday. And the same goes with tomorrow. Like that's as far as future and past go for her. And it's really just kind of delightful. And you're right. You're right. This wave-like style of writing is kind of teaching us as readers how to surf. It's not just performing it, it's requiring a certain kind of readership from us, kind of teaching us we have to read in a very playful way in order to connect the dots. If we read linearly, this is a very frustrating text and we could get mad at her very easily. But if you just kind of let the waves come, by the end, you start to feel kind of this, you start to roll with them and you start to really sense connection where you might not have. She's teaching us how to surf. That actually reminds me, her friend, the surfer. Uh, she has this friend that she talks to who's learning how to surf, and she says for him, what is oh, she writes, he says, the old forms no longer serve. The old forms no longer serve. And I'm just curious what that line means to you, as a writer or as someone who works in physical medicine in the VA, where the body itself can outgrow its old forms. What does that line mean to you, where the old forms no longer serve?
Gotta change that podcast title.
Serious one. Serious one.
And for one thing that pops up for my population, then for where I work with, like the old forms, right? They don't serve. Their identity was in who they were. So I
Mm,
could be working with some, like I said, more of an older population, 60s, 70s, and yet who they were in the military is pretty much still who they identify with.
mm,
They're not. They haven't been able to kind of move forward. Your body has continued to change. What you did before does not serve you now. You need to be kind of fueling it differently, right? And I guess it would be the same for my own self as I've aged over these years since I was in the Marine Corps, right? I can't go out to just that crummy, Mexican hole in the wall place, eat that big old super nachos, and then go run, right? I can't. I eat that, and I'm down for 2 days. Um, so in a sense, those old forms, they served us at some point, but they don't serve us now. And the one phrase that I use, right, is that kind of always coming back to like that no pain, no gain type of thing. And it served us well when we're in the military, if we're on the battlefield. You're right. We don't have time for our own pain. Everybody else, in a sense, is, the whole mission is more important, but that's where it's kind of we tweak that, right? Instead of no, we change it to KNOW, right? No, understand pain, understand gain, and how the whole thing begins to kind of shift. And yet, if I'm rooted in who I was, I have a hard time accepting where I am.
mhm, mhm. So this is kind of a personal question. If you don't want to answer, that's fine. But I'm curious to hear, what forms have stopped serving you, and maybe what new forms or waves are you learning to trust?
Right, I believe it is the stereotypical, right, Marine who used to drink. All right, I used to drink heavily, and doctor telling me, "Hey, you're okay right now. You're young, but you might want to think about not drinking so much at some point." I'm like, "I'll be all right." Um, but in a sense, right, that was the culture. That was kind of the culture I immersed myself into with the Marine Corps, the military. That's what I grew up with, of a family in a sense of alcoholics, and so you move forward, and those things don't serve me. I'm not against alcohol, but I may go months without having anything to drink. I don't get drunk anymore. I've got too many things of life that I really want to experience, and I don't want that cloudedness, if you will. And I think I shared with you at one point, right? I would do a lot of my writing, right? Like a lot of these people drunk, right? I'd have a couple bottles of wine and I'd wake up and I'd be like, hey, what magic elves wrote this?
Mhm.
And not really sure. Whereas now, like I'll do other things of like getting into the sauna and exploring writing from that fashion. And
Cool.
so it's very sobering to a different degree versus, intoxication. And so that would be something I would say of how I've changed in my own life, because that allows me to reflect more with more clarity on where I am and what is happening.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And as you're talking, I'm realizing that I think of intoxication as being a more oceanic state, like lulling, but actually I'm realizing it's just the new state that is that feels oceanic at times, like sometimes if the familiar structure is alcohol, then that's your mountain. If the thing that becomes your comfort zone, your safety, even if it is something like intoxication, that can become the structure that is so rigid that it's holding you back, then sobriety itself could be, or at least not aiming away from alcoholism could be its own kind of ocean, a new place to kind of try to figure out what your new boundaries are, try to figure out what your new way of being is. That new self can feel oceanic. And I wonder if that's a way of thinking about it too, the mountains being comfortable, oceans being outside of that comfort zone. And it reminds me too of something that Manguso said at the beginning, that mountains are actually not that safe in the first place. We just think they are. We think they are because they're familiar and we're used to them. She says, I used to be interested in mountains. They moved at a speed I could deal with. They waited for me to catch up. It was like that all my life. Then we moved to California. And after 8 years of earthquakes, I began to doubt my ability to put things in order. I began to distrust the very idea of order. The mountains were no longer guiding me. So here are the mountains, the very things that are emblems of stability and trust and the thing you can't push over. Earthquakes unsettle them all the time. And they in fact are evidence of the shifting of tectonic plates that create earthquakes. So even the mountains aren't stable. So in it, I love how as you're speaking, I start noticing that for you, the oceanic form is actually not intoxication at all, but this new self that you're learning through writing. Um, yeah, that's your ocean. I love that. Does it does that feel right to you too, or do you have a different way of seeing that? Or am I borrowing the wrong language?
No, I think yeah, there's some like, aspects of truth in there. One thing that kind of comes up there is stillness in the water, but right, typically there's some flow to it. Something's moving, and we do see mountains as being very still. Um, but stillness for people at times is very chaotic. They don't know how to be there. We don't, right? And you heard my little rant about social media. We're always just constant distraction. And you take away their phone and allow them to be with their thoughts, allow people to be bored. They're in this stillness and they don't know what to do.
Hmm.
So at times, then being on a mountain, if I lost cell phone reception, right, is that then very chaotic because I don't have, right, these electronic leashes tying me back to society.
Hmm, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's where some things that kind of that's where I was starting to go with the mountain, although it's very disruptive and yet it can provide some more stillness that in itself can be very right disruptive.
Yeah, absolutely. And you wrote a little bit about that in your reflective writing. You wrote about that mountain, how even the mountain changes shapes over time and how it can be one thing to you at one point in your life and something totally
Yeah.
different at another. Yeah. Yeah, and as we're talking, I'm also noticing it's not just about new and old, but about I think will and surrender. There's something happening with will and surrender here. It feels like for me, at least in the way Manguso's using the terms, there's there's will to a mountain, or at least seemingly so, whereas there's a kind of surrender that you have to undertake when you when you embark on the ocean. You can't just stand there stiff as a board and like expect to float. Like you have to kind of somehow surrender to it. I'm wondering how you navigate that tension between will and surrender with your patients as you work in pain care.
Wow. All right. I guess it would be, you know, bringing back my old Marine Corps days, and buddies would want to go out to the club, and I'm like, sure, I don't know how to dance, but I'm going to go out there and try to figure out what it is I'm doing and mimic what somebody else is doing, and so, and have fun. And so you're dancing with them.
Mhm.
You're sitting there, but metaphorically, you're dancing with them to try to see where it is that they're at, because through their words, they'll start to guide you, right? And so that's when you start kind of getting that understanding of where are they rooted, right? Or are they just in that resignation of pain? Do they have acceptance or wanting to kind of continue to move forward? What do they have? And if it is just this surrender, um, perhaps they're not ready for me right now, because what I ask of them is to, right, what they don't want to do, kind of going back to my rant once again about social media and quick fixes, right? There is no hack. There's no hack to developing strength. You have to put in the work, right? Whatever that is, our bodies were made to have load applied to them so that way they can respond and adapt. And if they're not ready for this, that's okay. How do we get somebody get them lined up with somebody else for the place that they're in? And those that are wanting to explore that will, right? That's where we're trying to allow them. So looking at the metaphors of the mountain and the ocean, like the mountain, yeah, there's the will. I can see the summit. I know where it is that I'm going, where versus, yeah, you're right. I'm in the ocean and I surrender to it because I don't know where the bottom is. I don't know how deep I can go. And so that's the dance I would say I have with them.
Yeah. Ooh.
I'm just like, where are you at to do?
Yeah. I love that metaphor of the dance. What I hear in that metaphor is that it's not about it's not about the oceans being better than the mountains, and that's ergo we should always aim for ocean, because who could live like that, right? Who could live in a state of pure surrender, you know, lolling about in the wet, dimensionless chaos, you know. It's really about a dance between the two, dance between will and surrender, dance between old and new. Um, and in that balance, I'm hearing, you know, that the mountain provides strength and stillness was a great word that you used earlier, whereas the ocean can provide play and creation and creativity, but also maybe some necessary destruction too, or the destruction that's already happened in the past and acceptance of those things, the surrender to those things. So I love the metaphor of the dance, being able to dance between it. Uh, I believe it was Justin earlier who had that great in the background of podcast, I think for week 3, week 2 maybe. You know, life is about learning how to dance in the rain. And I really hear that coming. I hear that I'm always trying to figure out what the ethic is of this text. How can we turn this into an ethic? How can we turn this into a way we should live? And maybe that's way too simplistic of a way of reading. But I think that's one ethic that may be emerging for me here is trying to learn how to dance between the oceanic and the mountainous. Yeah. Do you have any ethics that emerge for you after reading this? Ways that you are inspired to approach your life or your profession differently based on things we've been discussing?
No, I think I go into things pretty open minded, and I think at certain times it perhaps guides me a certain way of where I want to go, where I don't want to go, what's a possibility, or at times even it's reaffirming. And
Mm,
so perhaps this time it is kind of reaffirming of how I'm living life and these acceptance of things and right now I'm drawing a blank on the phrase these non-deliberate right actions. And
right.
so how do we deliberately create more non-deliberate? So
Right. Right.
I guess perhaps in this moment kind of more reaffirming, right? I think it is always kind of ongoing and just this evolving, and I think when we stop that's when I don't know, that really kind of just has me thinking then because I've been kind of fascinated with. There's some friends that I have in high school, and it seems like they've not really done much, quote unquote, with their lives, if you will. Maybe they got married and have kids and have a house, and they go to their job every day, and they go on their yearly vacations, and they go to the bar a couple times a night, have a couple pints, and I'm like, I don't know. Is that happiness? Are they just drowning misery? Is this just the mundane aspects of what's pushed forward on how we're supposed to live life? Or I don't know. And that's where I sometimes kind of question. I'm like, why am I then perhaps surrendering to the ocean? And they're just kind of sitting on the mountain with that stillness. And is that better? Or is that just what they've accepted? Or perhaps they're in their own ocean that I don't perceive because I see them sitting on the mountain because they're looking stagnant to my point of view. I don't know.
No, I feel you on that. I'm from a really small town in Alabama on the beach. And I have a lot of friends who still live there and have wonderful, big, happy lives. There was a time in my life where, I would look back and I'd be like, oh, I'm so glad I didn't get just stuck on that beach in Alabama. Like I'm so glad that I've traveled and I have, I went to university and I have whatever, like I have these ideas of my accomplishments. And then I go back home and I go back to that beach in Alabama and I see them, just hanging out by the sand dunes and having a beer and enjoying a sunset. And I'm like, wait a minute. Which one of us figured this thing out? I don't know. Yeah, I feel you on that. It is very hard to judge somebody else's right mix of ocean and mountain. I think maybe all we have access to is our own and whatever parts of the mountain and ocean they show to us. So thank you so much, Daniel, for joining me, for bringing your poet's eye and curiosity, also your wisdom and experience as a physical therapist. And thank you for listeners for joining us again for The Bridge, where medicine meets the arts. Next time on The Bridge, we will move from temporality to transformation. We'll be looking at counter narratives in week 7. So we'll explore how stories can transform, empower, and amplify voices that have been silenced or overlooked. We'll ask how storytelling itself can become a form of resistance. So if this week asked us to surrender control, next week we'll invite us to reclaim it by telling new stories where old ones once erased us. Thank you so much again, Daniel. So much fun to talk to you, sweet friend. And I'll see everybody next week.